I'm so excited to have Dr. Debbie Zacarian back on the podcast. This is like her fourth time on the podcast, and today she brought a beloved colleague, Dr. Becky Cohn-Vargas, to join us to talk about their new book called Identity Safe Spaces, partnering to overcome inequities. Well, no better partners to have both of you on to talk about your book. Welcome both to the podcast. Let's talk about the introduction. Becky, please tell us about what is meant by identity safe. In the foreword, a renowned psychologist describes this book as groundbreaking in bringing together parents and guardians and educators to promote positive identity development and to create identity safe spaces.
Sure. Well, first I want to tell you how happy I am to be here with Debbie. We met through our editor at the Corwin Book Company, who matchmade us and got us together because he knew we were doing very similar kinds of work. And the work I've been doing has been developing ways to create spaces. And in the past, it's mainly been classrooms. And now in this book, we're looking not only at school, but at home, but places for children and young people where they feel safe, welcomed, and particularly this is important for kids who've been marginalized in different kinds of ways. And some of my work has been focused on race, on LGBTQ students, on kids who've been bullied.
Can you share about some research that served as foundation for understanding and implementing identity safety?
Sure. Let me give you another way of looking at identity safety with a metaphor. Think about identity theft. Everybody knows about identity theft. It's the idea that, wait a minute, I can't function as myself. My identity has been stolen. Can't go to the bank. I can't use my credit cards. I can't buy anything. People don't believe I am who I am. Now think about that on an emotional or a psychic level, how that feels. If your identity has been maligned by being treated as less than, by negative stereotypes, or somebody who's trying to make you feel bad about who you are. Identity safety is about creating those spaces where people's identities are not stolen, where people don't feel like they have to leave their identity at the door. All of us have many social identities. We have group memberships, our family, our racial and ethnic identities, our religion, our social class, our profession. All those identities come together to make us who we are. And the home and school are where we get the foundation for the identities we have that shift over our whole lifetime. And so it's also where we learn how to face adversity and experiences that undermine it. So the research was done in 2000 by two, Claude Steele is a well-known researcher, social psychologist who's looked at issues of stereotype threat, which means people who are negatively impacted by negative stereotypes about their identity. And particularly in terms of schooling, a research study was created called the Stanford Integrated Schools Program. And this program research study was done with students in integrated classrooms where there were practically equal numbers. They saw at a school district where there were Black, Latino, white, and Asian students. And they wanted to discover the impact of a positive identity on their academic progress. So they worked with 1,700 students in 84 classrooms. And they had observers who didn't know what the research was about with this list of 200 items. And they went into classrooms and they observed the students, and they did that 3 times over the year. They also looked at the surveys that the students who were 3rd and 5th graders filled out, where they talked about how they felt about school, how they felt about their teachers, and their sense of identity safety in their classrooms. And then they gathered test scores at the end of the year. So they had these several points of research. And if the students had trouble reading, they would read the surveys to them. When they gathered the research, they discovered that some classrooms had more students that felt identity safe. And in those classrooms, the students also did better on standardized tests. So they demonstrated that when kids felt more identity safe, they did better in school. But then they did one more thing. They looked at what the teachers were doing in those classrooms where kids were more identity safe. And that's where they discovered 4 major domains with which they call the domains of identity safe teaching. One of them was classroom relationships, the relationship with the teacher and the student and among the students. Another one was diversity as a resource, where they were looking at the diversity in positive ways. And they had very concrete ways they were looking at that. They also looked at caring classrooms, where kids were learning empathy, where they cared about each other, where they cooperated. And then they looked at child-centered teaching, which was a manner of teaching where the children's needs were put in the center. And I'm sure you've had many speakers that have talked about that. So they categorize those into 14 components that honor the authentic identities of students. And out of that, they show that we can foster identity safety, not by erasing the differences and telling kids to leave their identities at the door, but rather by honoring and highlighting the differences and getting kids to learn about each other, work together, and feel a sense of agency. So our book is one where we explore the partnership of educators and parents to promote identity safety. And we also promote ways to work with the families. So when we say parents, we also include the guardians and caregivers that raise children who maybe are not their own. And we suggest that they have a listening campaign to bring in the community of the families, the parents, the caregivers, and talk to them about how they can also support their children and what things we can do in schools to help them. So that's kind of the essence of the research and what we did with it.
Before we, so the research is fascinating. I wanted to know if, before we start talking about more deeply about the book, what was the reason why both of you chose to write this book? Or could you share a story that really inspired you to start this book?
Well, I would say for me, I'm a parent of 3 children. My husband's Nicaraguan. I'm Jewish. He's Catholic. And so we have a lot of diversity within our own family. And all 3 of my children are LGBTQ. So I've had a lot of experience working with trying to think about how they could feel belonging. My parents were Holocaust refugees. They escaped the Holocaust. So I spent all my life thinking about how to stop bigotry and how to end it. So I know that creating identity safety in schools is a wonderful thing, and that's where most of my writing and my previous books have been. But bringing in the families, think about the long-term identity safety. How can we work together? And that's what inspired me. And especially Debbie's work, I wanted to partner with her, and we both share a lot in that arena.
Debbie, do you want to share why you started wrote this book, or what
Yeah,
story was
yeah, I
behind
think
it?
I'll be a little bit more current. The very first week of COVID, when all of us were sheltering in place, basically, and concerned about what was going on, our editor, Jan Alpert, who you know, Ton, as a writer as well, gathered authors together. It was quite wonderful because it was at the very beginning, and he just wanted to gather authors together to ask how we were doing. And one of the people at that Zoom meeting of authors, most of whom I knew, was an author, Becky, whose work I had read, and I had the opportunity to meet her and listen to her at that meeting where Becky was talking about being a new grandma. Her daughter had just had a baby, and Becky talked a bit about identity safety, and I saw so many connections between her contributions and mine. And one of them being that I've always looked at how do we help learners to feel safe, a sense of belonging, value, competence, and the confidence to speak up on behalf of themselves and others. And so when Becky was using this language, I thought, wow, this is so fascinating. So while most of my work has been on how to really help students from culturally and linguistically diverse communities and neurodiverse communities. Both of us had written about the importance of family engagement. So we first began writing a couple of blogs together. And we then talked about the need for extending a book on this wonderful, well-researched concept of identity safety that kind of dovetailed so beautifully with the work I had contributed and the research that I had done. And we were looking at, well, how do we really create identity safe spaces at home and school, and how can schools partner with families? So this was a wonderful way of kind of bringing two people together who have very different but very complementary backgrounds. And in our first meeting together, we wanted to come up with a new term that would encompass all of these ideals about gender, about race, about cultural and linguistic diversity, about neurodiversity, and other types of diversities that would be kind of this term that we could use that really encompassed what most classroom teachers are experiencing in their classes. And at first we talked about, well, is it heterogeneity? What is it? And we came up with the term, or we coined the term, multi-diverse, to bring out our own expertise in these various areas together and to bring different voices into the discussion. And so part of it was also thinking, if we do this book project together, wouldn't it be wonderful to bring in the voices of many people? So when we described the book, we interviewed 29 people, ranging in age from a student all the way to age 70, and their experience feeling safe or not feeling safe, what their experiences were that kind of helped them think about this concept that we were writing about. And their voices are such a powerful part of the principles that we present on how to partner with families.
That's similar to the book that you wrote with Margot Gottlieb and Margarita Calderon on Beyond Crisis, like bringing everything together. And so I'm happy that you're extending this to another concept of identity safe spaces. Let's talk about creating a culture of caring. Why do you believe creating a culture of caring is required as a first step to fostering student identity? And how do we do that?
Well, that's a really important question, and one that a lot of researchers are exploring, the sense of caring for and caring about our students. And we present research on who we are as educators. And that's so important because our student and family populations are changing rapidly. And they're becoming much, much more multi-diverse. Yet, most university faculty and teacher education programs and the pre and in-service teachers that they're training are white and middle class, and it hasn't changed very much. So some examples of the differences between who we are as educators and who our students are and what their experiences are include some factors like 76,000 Afghanis who were airlifted out of Afghanistan to the US due to the Taliban taking over in 2020. That's one factor. Another, if we think about present times, are the Ukrainians, Israelis, Palestinians who are fleeing or have fled their homelands for the US. And then there's those many who are crossing the border, having made the dangerous, arduous journey from their homelands. And then there's the epic number of the general student population who've experienced significant abuse, neglect, or household challenge, and the high incidence of students who are being bullied or face bias-based harassment. So we look at what actions can we as educators take to really support this culture of caring through the power of really listening and really truly building strong partnerships at home with families and at school with our students and each other, colleagues we work with, our local communities. Just what does that mean to really create this culture where students absolutely know they're cared for and they're cared about?
The people who you described, like the refugees, people who are coming, you remind me of like my family, and it's like it's so important to support those students as well. And this is what your book is doing. In the chapter Understanding Our Own Identity, you state, as educators, it is critical for us to understand that our life experiences, that is, who we are as individuals and communities of people, can be vastly different from many of our individual and group of students. What's the value of having educators reflect on their identity as they seek to support diverse identities?
Yeah, you bring up a great point. So as educators, we're all individuals. So we all come to this with our own individual belief system and our own thinking about how do we teach, how do students learn, and who we are and what our goals are. And they can be our background experiences can be so vastly different from our students that we may find ourselves making the mistake of assuming that all of our students are being reared in communities like ours, whatever that means. So, and that's so not true. So we use these wonderful examples of what we mean. So I'm just going to share one of them, and that's Jesus Menha, who is one of the people we interviewed. Briefly, Jesus was reared on the Texas-Mexico border. And while we might have different perceptions of what that means, what does it mean to grow up on the Texas-Mexico border? He describes one of the places that he lived when he was a young child with his parents, his sister, and others. And what he says in this one sentence is he lived in an old warehouse where Jesus and his family were separated by a blanket so they could have some privacy from another family who lived in the same warehouse on the other side of the same blanket. So we ask educators or readers of our book, who we hope will be pre- and in-service educators taking courses or engaging in professional development, in what ways does Jesus's childhood home environment, in what ways is it the same and different from our own? And be as detailed as possible. So we have readers, our intent is to have readers really look at this and look at Jesus, and who was so courageous, as all of the 29 that we interviewed were, in sharing who he is, where he lived as a young child, and the bias that we might feel in considering the differences between his experiences and our own. So that's one of our goals, is really look at that much more deeply. And we also ask readers to think about the epic number of students truly living with adversity and those who experience abuse, neglect, household challenge, and think about what scholar Kenneth Hardy talks about when he uses the term and is renowned for the term racial trauma, of repeated experiences that really devalue one's sense of race and sense of self. What does that look like? So we use another example of what we mean when we use the word racial trauma. And Lori is a Black engineer. So this is a contributor who is an engineer who recalled a childhood experience when she was 4 years old. And she just moved into a new home in this 4-year story of herself as a 4-year-old. And she meets a neighborhood girl who comes over and is probably around 2.5 years old. So she's 4. She meets this neighbor who's 2.5. And the little child calls Lori the N-word at 2.5, and she's 4. So Lori had a powerful negative reaction to that word at 4 years old, which she explains in our book what she did when she heard that comment. And this was her very first introduction to a recollection that she had about racism. And it's something she says she's dealt with her whole life. So we asked 2 questions. First is, explain how Lori's reaction, what you think of Lori's reaction in by drawing from Hardy's definition of racial trauma. And then we ask, how does Lori's reaction resonate or not resonate with you and your childhood experiences, to kind of help people think deeply about what one experiences when they've experienced really this phenomena as a young child. So examples such as these and the actions and actions such as, what happens when we mispronounce a student's name, or we place students of color and multilingual learners in lower level courses than their peers, or what happens, more importantly, when we reduce one's identity or eliminate it entirely. So we really want to look at what does that mean around who we are as educators and what our students' experience is. And the value for all of us in doing this is to become much more open and flexible in holding a respectful dialogue, a really respectful dialogue to support this wonderful concept and phenomena of identity safety by giving everyone a voice, by building bridges of empathy, supporting respectful dialogue, and truly positive habits of mind about ourselves and others, so that we can really assess what we do and we can reflect on what we do, and so that we can be much more intentional around creating truly identity safe spaces for ourselves, our students, and their families.
What happens when, so both of you can answer this question. This is following your question, your response. What do we do for teachers who are from cultural backgrounds that are very different than our students, and realities are very different? How do you create that? Like, how do we get to know our students without being invasive? How do we not assume things about students? You gave us some ideas like, let's not put them in lower level classes. Let's call them by their names that they want to be used. But what else can we do specifically to get to know students better without being invasive and creating that culture of caring?
I think that's a great question. What steps do we take? And maybe the traditional steps that people take are saying, don't do this. Make sure you pronounce kids' names correctly. Make sure you do this and you do that. And in our book, what we really emphasize is how important it is to listen and what that looks like. And we give steps and sequences for carrying on these listening experiences, so that we're not proselytizing to people about what not to do, but we provide opportunities for, here's what listening looks like. And here's ways that questions that we might ask that really look for the positives and the strengths of students, so that they can tell their story and they can be empowered to have a voice, and their parents as well. And then a second and equally important point is, it's not just about listening, but it's also enacting language and enacting ways of talking about our students and talking with our students and with their families that really look at our partnering together and what that means. So it's not, I would say it's not so much about rules to follow as it is about being open and flexible and being willing to make mistakes, and being willing to try new ideas, and doing so to be really curious about, how do we make this work? And what are our students and their families' assets, so that we can all partner together and find the goodness in one another?
So I'll add on a little to what Debbie said. All she said is so important. It's all about creating the culture of trust, because without trust, people don't feel safe and they don't want to share. But if you've created that trust and that openness, and that includes teachers sharing a little bit of their own lives and creating opportunities for kids to bring their home life and their family life into the school, bringing their family life into their school, and inviting families to come into the school. And once you create that, it mushrooms, and people just have a wonderful time sharing and making food together. I'll give an example of when I was a principal. We had a dance festival. I was a principal in a large school, in elementary school in Oakland, California, and we had a dance festival. But instead of a dance festival with performances, it was teaching each other dances. And at that time, the Macarena was in style, so we all danced the Macarena. And then a group of of Cambodian parents taught us how to dance a Cambodian dance. And we had all these different dances, and the auditorium was full. There were probably 300 people, grown-ups, children, dancing away. And that's the kind of thing that could only happen if there's enough trust and safety for people to feel that they're welcome and that they're not an exotic, different person, but rather that they're part of a group and that we can all do it and we can all teach each other. And the other ways I think it's important to do it is recognizing, as Debbie said, that it's okay to make mistakes. We are going to pronounce people's names wrong, but it's how we interact when we do that. It's how we recognize, oh, I didn't mean to pronounce your name wrong. Work on trying to get it right. And teachers have, even high school teachers have all these complicated methods where they try and learn every child's name and they greet kids at the door. There are ways to do this and create this trust and safety. And from people sign up, and you don't force it, and you don't ask them to share anything they don't want to share. And it little by little, that trust builds, and there's a wonderful climate, and the parents come and they participate and they all get to know each other. But it's an approach. There isn't one thing. It's many different things people do.
Thank you for illuminating, using those examples to illuminate your idea here. Let's look at positive identity development. Why does it matter? You've interviewed 29 people, parents, students, educators, really different backgrounds. What did you learn from them what did you learn from them about what helps supports positive identity development? And what can educators and teachers foster that?
So it was wonderful doing those interviews, and each interview ended up going for almost 2 hours. Of course, we couldn't put everything into it because once people start talking about their lives, they have so much to share. And so we learned so many different things about how people's identities developed, things that happened that were very traumatizing. Like, for example, there was Leisha, who is now a medical doctor. She's African American. When she was in middle school, her square dance teacher used to have boys go over and pick girls as partners. And every single time she was left standing there, nobody picked her as a partner. She was the only Black girl in the class. And she talked about how that felt and how that hurt her and impacted her for her whole life. We also talk about in the book ways you could avoid things like that. It's being that awareness, as Debbie was talking about, listening. It's listening and noticing and paying attention. There were other ways that teacher could have done it. And we talk about, we're not trying to say that people are doing things wrong, but we're trying to show what it's like from a different person's perspective. We also learned how educators help their children, and parents and guardians help their children develop pride in their identity. And over, we heard them talk about two really important elements. One was having many, many positive experiences to affirm their social identities. And two, helping children learn how to counteract the negative experiences. And so one example of a positive experience was Chen Kong-Wick, who escaped Cambodia as a 7-year-old during the genocide. And she shared how her daughter, she's married to a man who is born in America, who's white. And so she wanted to bring forward her culture to her daughter. So she would cook with her daughter, and she made curry. And while they cooked, not only did she teach her how to make the curry, but she taught her daughter about her life and shared some of her experiences. And that develops that pride and understanding of one's culture. We talked to people who talked about the role models in their life. Debbie mentioned Jesus, who grew up in Texas near the border, and he only had one teacher who shared his Chicano background the whole time from kindergarten through grade 12. And that teacher was Mr. Perez, his chemistry teacher. And that teacher had such a profound influence on Jesus that he influenced Jesus to go to college. And that there weren't very many kids from that community that went on to college. But Jesus went on to college, and what did he decide to do? He decided to become a chemist, and he followed the role model. And interestingly, he later became a journalist and was the public relations person at UC Berkeley in California. So he was inspired by this role model, and then that gave him the courage to go on and actually pursue his own dreams. And now he's writing a book about his experiences growing up in Texas. We also feel it's important to help children process the feelings when they have those negative experiences. We can't make sure that our kids don't have those experiences, no matter what that happens. And so there was a woman named Laura Smith, and she's a white woman married to an African-American man, and they have a 12-year-old son. And so they knew that when their son was getting older, it was important to discuss some of the things that might happen, and particularly when he was learning to drive, that he might get stopped, and some of the brutality that happens when Black people of all different social classes get stopped by the police. And so she explains in the interview how her husband Ken shared his experiences with their son and helped him learn what to do, specifically guiding him not to run away and how to keep himself as safe as possible. So these are just a couple of the things. There were so many things that came up because we talked to people of so many different backgrounds and experiences, and the intersections of different identities. And those were things we learned, and we tried to bring them forward because all of those things will help teachers become more aware and help other parents as well.
Oh, those are just some of the 29 stories. I mean, they're just they bring the humanity into your book, which is about education. Right? So let's look at harnessing the power of connectedness, cooperation, and compassion. Can you explain why connectedness, cooperation, and compassion are so important when fostering identity, safety in students, including how these concepts relate to each other?
Well, when people learn to cooperate and cooperate with empathy and compassion, that promotes identity safety for everyone. And so the words connection, cooperation, and compassion all come together in creating that belonging people feel. And it's actually something that humans have done for thousands of years. We wouldn't have survived if we hadn't learned. So that's where the work of helping a student develop positive identity and identity safety overlaps with social emotional learning, because it's a set of skills and it's attitudes that help them develop healthy identities, manage their emotions, and achieve goals. And in this diverse world, and every culture, every country, every classroom has many diverse identities in it, whether they all share the same ethnic background or language, there still are so many different things that people bring forward. And so we actually looked in the concept of multi-diversity, we looked at the intersections of identity. And for example, we interviewed a young man named Samir, who's a college student. His mother is from Pakistan, and she's a Muslim, and his father is a Hindu from India. And Samir shared that he was gay, and the process of growing up, first not really even knowing the term gay and being bullied for liking to do girl things, as he put it, and he would hide his dolls under the bed when his friends came over. And his parents were very accepting, but they growing up, didn't realize how much he was bullied. And then when he was in high school, he went to a private high school where people on the first day were introducing themselves and saying, "These are my pronouns." He had to go home and look up on Google what it meant to have different pronouns. And he became aware of his own identity and started feeling more accepted. And so he actually educated his parents, and they promised they'd love, he says, they promised they'd love me no matter what. But when they understood what this meant to me, they became 100% supportive, and they decided to post on Facebook. And on Facebook, they wrote, this was in Fremont, California, where this happened. His parents, who really hadn't known much about gay people before that, they wrote that if anyone didn't support me, this again a quote, they wouldn't be part of our life anymore. And Samir ended in the interview by saying it was incredibly courageous of them, and obviously the right thing to do. And then Samir went back to his elementary and middle school, talked with the teachers and the educators, and talked to them about what he experienced. And he ended up at the age of 16 writing a little book about how to support LGBTQ students in public school. So this kind of sense of developing a positive identity happened over many years. And that's why we like working with the families, because it isn't going to happen in 1 year in one classroom. It happens as children feel valued and part of a group, as they connect to one another and they feel belonging. And in this culture of interdependence, where everyone cares for each other and the norms of the classroom are based on helping each other, that's where everybody learns together.
What an empowering, moving story that Shamir shared with you. Debbie, let's talk about building empowerment, engagement, and resilience. How can educators foster engagement how can educators foster empowerment and agency in students to bolster their sense of identity and safety?
Yeah, we really believe strongly that identity safety can only happen when we empower students to have a real voice and a choice. And I think Samira is a wonderful example of that type of agency. So in our book, we provide another really wonderful example from Rebecca Mikulski about her son, Matthew, who's a 7th grader. And just as background, Matthew's on the autistic spectrum. And when he was in 3rd grade, so she was recounting a 3rd grade experience, his teacher recognized how challenging it was for Matthew to participate in class during story time. And she also knew that it would be important to work with Matthew's parents around how to help him participate. So when they met together, and we really talk about, how do we really empower our students to have a voice and agency, and who better to partner with than their family, right? So the teacher met with Rebecca and her husband, and through their discussion, they talked about how Matthew was extremely motivated by rewards. He loved rewards, and he loved Star Wars and puzzles. So those were 3 things that he was very interested in obtaining a reward. He loved Star Wars and he loved doing puzzles. So with Rebecca and her husband's permission, Matthew's teacher came up with a program to help motivate Matthew's participation and confidence in participating during story time. So every week, with this parent's permission, she printed out pictures of Matthew's favorite Star Wars characters and then cut these images into puzzle pieces. And then she encouraged Matthew to participate. And if he participated, she would later and privately reward him with a single puzzle piece. And through the week, Rebecca told us that each day, Matthew would proudly put the puzzle pieces together quietly. And at the end of the week, he would bring home his personalized completed puzzle. So over the school year, the puzzles got larger, and Matthew had to wait longer and answer more questions to participate during story time. And we provide a resource in our book and ask readers about which of 30 attributes are ones that Matthew exhibited. So we tell the story about Matthew and his putting the puzzle together. But what we add to it is, here are some attributes of empowerment. Which ones do you feel Matthew exhibited of these 30? So we talk about, when Becky and I did this task, we looked at these attributes of empowerment, and we agreed on some of the attributes that we saw Matthew exhibit, so that if we were his teacher, we would positively affirm them for him. and help him feel empowered. And we saw that he was determined and that he persevered and that he was assertive and very respectful of others. We noted the language that he used with his peers and his teacher, all the while engaging in a level of self-control. So what we identify or help identify is this little story about Matthew's teacher working with his parent. Really shows how we can empower students when we work with parents and we find what motivates and what helps students be invested. And all students, we know, need to be receptive to others, assertive with others to truly be empowered and have agency. And we describe how valuable it was for his teacher to harness the partnerships and helping students such as really be and feel empowered. And what we also do in the book is we describe 5 different stages of empowerment development. So we don't want to just say be empowered. We want to help us all see that empowerment doesn't occur like that. One has to go through stages to truly be empowered. And we use definitions of what we mean, beginning with, well, what does it mean if someone's pre-emerging? They're really beginning to think about being empowered, and they're sort of stepping into it, or emerging, or developing, enacting, and finally integrating. So we're using language that many teachers are familiar with, but we use clear definitions of what empowerment development looks like. So explaining that each of these levels takes time, but what helps us is really knowing what stage students are at so that we can support them on the continuum. So we don't have an expectation that students are going to go from 0 to being fully empowered. And Matthew is such a wonderful example because he was at the pre-emerging stage. He's just beginning, and he was just beginning in 3rd grade to learn the terms, the words, the idioms and phrases, or what I call, and now Becky calls TWIPs, that are very dependent on his listening carefully to his teacher for explanations and models, and for what participating means and what that looks like during story time. So we know that the teacher is going to have to model and show Matt specifically what types of language to use, what types of words to use, how to carefully listen. And in that sense, a big part of what his teacher did was partner with Matthew and his parents. And they first brainstormed ideas of what might help him participate. And then they launched the plans that they made. And his teacher routinely shared Matthew's successes. And that's a very important part of empowerment, is really sharing one's successes with that student to sort of help further empower them, and also share them with his family. And so should we all do that, celebrate students' successes and share them with our families. And another key strategy to build partnerships with families is by empowering their children to engage in such things as, and we describe this and we sequence this, is to engage students in student-led parent-teacher conferences, so that instead of the traditional parent-teacher conference where a teacher tells a parent what their child is doing and how their child is acting and so forth, we provide several sequence steps and strategies for doing this so that students feel a sense of safety and trust, belonging, value, and competence, that real sense of identity safety, to share and celebrate what they're learning, why they're learning it, and what they're accomplishing and celebrating. And activities such as student-led conferences, whether online or in person, can really support us all in empowering our students.
Oh, that story about Matthew and how his teachers like use store words and little puzzle pieces, and that really shows like the partnership between families, students, and school working well together. Let's move to our penultimate question. Moving away from same old habits to professional growth, what practices do you suggest will motivate educators to move away from same old habits and foster an approach to build on students' strengths and assets of both educators and students?
So what we talk about is the importance, a critical importance, of really committing to moving away from a strength weakness, good bad doing well, not doing well binary, because that using that, positive, negative way of thinking really overlooks the many, many positive possibilities of looking carefully at what's going well and how what's going well can be strengthened. So almost all of the examples in our book is about how we can really strengthen how students see themselves and see others. And an example that we use in a book is a metaphor. So in the book, we use this example of a patient, and I'll call him Johnny here for a way of describing it. So Johnny goes to the doctor because he's got a bad infection, and he's given antibiotics to take 4 times a day for 10 days. So instead, Johnny takes 1 pill instead of the prescribed 8 pills a day. And using a strength-based response, when he comes back to the doctor and he's very sick, the doctor very kindly asked Johnny if he was able to take 8 pills a day. And reluctantly, Johnny tells his doctor that he only took 1 per day because he's afraid to take medicine. So together, they come up with a co-powered solution that considers his fears without being judgmental and includes the doctor's office checking on him to make sure he's comfortable taking all of the medicine. So throughout Johnny's second journey, he's praised for his efforts. So if we look at, what his doctor in this hypothetical story did, the doctor really positively looked at what Johnny was able to do and helped him go through this journey of getting well, instead of finding fault with him and, saying things like, you didn't take your medicine, why not, or whatever. So we provide a roadmap of creating identity safe spaces at home and at school by showing how we can give children positive experiences that continuously affirm their multiple and varied identities and also their efforts. So how we can go about doing that. And we also talk about supporting our own awareness, and we offer tools to deconstruct, dismantle, and counteract the power of negative stereotypes about identity. And we talk about helping children celebrate their different social identities and diversities as a resource. So first, we suggest that educators use a cycle of inquiry that includes being positive about partnering with diverse members, promoting that culture of care and curiosity, and being open and valuing our differences, and supporting us all the way through using strength-based practices where we view mistakes as opportunities for growth and we honor and celebrate successes. So we in the book, we include several tools, but in response to your question, we include 3 separate tools to promote identity safety on a very deep level. And one is a family survey tool for helping schools identify the partnership activities that families believe would be the most helpful. So instead of schools deciding for themselves, we have a tool where families can help us in understanding what would they feel would be the most helpful. And one part of the survey, for example, asked parents to check 3 activities from a list of 6 that they believe would be the most beneficial for their child. So instead of making assumptions, we want to provide a tool that really looks at what parents would find valuable. And it also asks families to add one that they think might help, rather than us making assumptions. So we, in the tool, we give space for families to contribute their own ideas. A second tool includes a self-reflection tool that looks at 24 key principles from each of the chapters of our book. So we looked at our book and we looked at 24 key principles, and we ask each reader to use the 24 as a guide for 2 purposes. First, to help us look at what's already happening and what does it look like in my practice, and how might I share that with others or celebrate what I'm doing well. And second, to determine what will occur and how it might be added to my professional practice. So we have these elements to look at and go back to the chapters and dig more deeply in. So for example, in the first chapter, we discuss the importance of bolstering identity safety by truly using a strength-based stance. So using the tool, readers would identify an example of what they're already doing and what it looks like, and what they'll add to it to make it even stronger. So our third tool offers a schema for really developing strong, inclusive, and empowered partnerships with parents and guardians. And the tool offers a means truly for identifying such important elements as how we notice and listen to student and parent voices, how we introduce identity safety or the concepts of it to our students, staff, parents, and guardians, what it means and why it's important, how we can form working groups to support our working together on this, how we can learn about families and what that would look like, how we can facilitate conversations about multidiversity, this really deep way of looking at these concepts. And this tool looks at how we can empower parents' sense of identity safety and how we can draw from our own community resources for support. So rather than just talk about it, we give these tools that explicitly give us a way to examine it for ourselves in our own personal contexts and really look at how we can bring identity safety through these partnerships to really overcome some of the barriers to equity that we've all experienced and really help students flourish.
Thank you for those three resources. I'm sure there are many, many more that teachers can use in your book. Becky, is there anything that you wanted to add as Debbie was talking about her last two questions?
I think Debbie did a great job of providing an overview of the kinds of things that came out in the book. The only thing I would add is that we tried to make the book really user-friendly so that all through the book, we have the vignettes, the stories, and questions. So the book itself is a professional development tool. And then the closing section, as Debbie described, has those three specific tools to kind of go back over what was in the book.
Right.
Identity safety is an approach. It is not a program that has a set of specific things you do. There are a myriad of things that can be done. And in the arena of working with families, that is true as well. So we really hope our readers will dive into it, think about their identities, think about their students and families. And it's really a joyful process.
Let's end the podcast with this. If you could ask teachers one thing that they could do to start tomorrow, next year. This is the end of the school year. This is the end of the 2023 year, and we're about to start the 2024. What is one thing teachers can do to create a safe identity place for their students and their colleagues?
I think I'll dip in. I'm not with Becky, but I can think Becky's brain is whirring and she'll have a wonderful answer as well. I think I would ask teachers to ask students. This is a wonderful time to really ask students how they feel, what their experience is, what's going well, and what they would like to strengthen. And I think that's part of the empowerment activity that's so important. So I think I would ask teachers to really but I would ask that question of students. And I think we would learn so much from what they have to share with us. And also I'd ask that question of families. What would you like? How can we help support you in partnering with us? What's going well? How might we strengthen it? And I think the more we engage in these important voices and listen carefully, the more powerful our educational experience is going to be with families and with their kids, and the more we can really overcome inequity.
I would add that I think it's a great idea to ask that question and then look at different ways to engage with with each child. And even high school students, even teachers in high schools who have many, many students can find creative ways to engage with each student. And there's one story that's not in the book, but a teacher who tells how she was misbehaving in high school, and she was always breaking rules and getting in trouble and getting suspended. But she had one teacher who greeted her at the door every day and who knew about her family and asked about her family and knew that her brother was being deported because he was not documented in the United States. And that teacher made such a difference for her. She acted completely different in that class and then was inspired to become a teacher. So that personal connection that you can find with each student, find something positive about each student, will add so much. And some students will communicate more in writing, and some will communicate in the large group, and some one-to-one. But that connection, that relationship, is a very good way to get started.
Well, what a wonderful. Go ahead, Debbie.
I'm sorry, with Becky bringing that up, there is a story we tell in the book that goes back to Matthew that Rebecca Mikulski shared with us. And when he, now he's in middle school, and she talks about how when he moved from elementary to middle school, a rite of passage is a locker that he had to use a combination and open, and he was unable to do that. So he couldn't really, couldn't figure out how to open the locker rapidly, as kids do between classes and so forth. So school suggested that they just take the lock off, and that way his locker would just be open and he wouldn't have to worry about it. And because his family had built this trusting relationship with educators, they went out and they found a company that makes locks that look like what's on the locker, but they're always open. So it doesn't, that it's such a wonderful find, right? So they went to the school and they said, we found this lock. It could go on the locker, and that way he'll look like everyone else, which is what they want for their child, to be a member of the school. And boy, was his school so happy to add that lock to the locker, because now Matt looks like everyone else. So when you think about how we can create these identity safe spaces, the school really created that space for his family to feel trusted enough so that they could go out and find a solution for their son, that the school would work in partnership with them. And we just thought that was such a great example of what we can do together as partners to really create these identity safe spaces.
I actually thought of a story in the book to amend my answer from the last one. There's one educator we interviewed, a Menominee Native American educator, and she has a story about her daughter, and her daughter was one of the few Native American students in that particular school. And one day her teacher said, I heard there was a powwow coming up next weekend, and if you get a chance and you go there, I'd love to hear about it. And that simple question by the teacher made such a difference for her daughter that ended up being her favorite teacher. And she did come back and tell about the powwow, and she did really well in that classroom. And so just a simple personal connection that teacher had with her made a whole lot of difference in that student's experience.
Every time you tell a story, I'm always thinking about, like, yes, it really is about Maslow's before blooms. And so you really both shared and weaved beautiful stories in and gave really practical strategies for teachers to create those safe spaces for the students. And that last story, again, shows like when we connect with students, they'll do so much better. And parents, they'll do so much better in school. So thank you so much for the gift of your book and the generosity of your time. I know this is going to be a fabulous resource for educators, in particular of multilingual learners, as they learn that they are in safe places.